History books about black slaves often include accounts saying that they were treated like animals. However, they don't go into the details and explain how African black slaves were actually dehumanized, tortured, and murdered. With every passing day during slavery, white slave owners, masters, and overseers would discover new methods to torture black slaves. You see, slavery was not the end. Rather, it was the start of a life of pain, humility, and blood. From being smoked alive to cutting black slaves' hands and feet, white slave owners would do unimaginable. They knew whatever they did would never be included in the history books being taught in the US and around the world today. But after researching, we have found the disturbing things that were normal to African black slaves during slavery. Watch this video because this is going to change how you think about history books and slavery and the horrifying ways black slaves were treated. Let's get started.
The Black History Archives.
Number 10. Public burnings. Sometimes what was done to black slaves shakes us to the very core. A punishment that was as horrifying as it was gruesome was the public burning of black slaves. You should know that these were not merely acts of private torment. They served as grotesque messages to other slaves and, shockingly, as disturbing entertainment for bystanders. In this nightmarish ritual, a slave accused of wrongdoing would meet a horrifying end, either tied to a stake or suspended above a roaring fire. This served a dual purpose, sending a chilling warning to other slaves, compelling them to witness in fear as the flames consumed a fellow enslaved person's body. It was a type of teaching and a reminder that disobedience or defiance would lead to the same horrific fate. But the horror did not stop at the gaze of fellow slaves. Owners from neighboring plantations and even residents of nearby towns would gather to witness these gruesome spectacles. They saw it as a form of dirty entertainment, as if the suffering and agony of human beings were some dark form of amusement. The cruelty and horror extended beyond the initial moments. Some slaves, overwhelmed by the smoke and searing heat, would faint or lose consciousness even before the fire fully consumed them. However, for many others, there was no escape. They were left to suffer as the flames engulfed them, their agonized cries piercing the air until they were silenced forever. It was a chilling reminder of the depths of cruelty that white slave owners could do with black slaves. Number 9. Smoking alive. During the dark days of slavery, the cruelty inflicted upon black slaves seemed boundless. Even though laws ostensibly protected them, the harsh reality was that these legal safeguards often existed only on paper in a predominantly white society. Consequently, slave owners would push the boundaries of cruelty when punishing their black slaves. This led to the horrifying practice known as smoking them alive. One chilling account comes from William W. Brown, a black slave who escaped and shared his harrowing experiences. He revealed a gruesome practice disturbingly common in Virginia. In this cruel ritual, a slave owner would tie up the slaves and lead them to a smokehouse. Once inside, the black slave faced not only physical whippings, but a much more sinister form of cruelty. The owner would ignite a fire using tobacco stems, filling the room with thick, suffocating smoke. Black slaves were forced to inhale this choking smoke as an additional form of punishment. The depths of cruelty and the utter disregard for human life during that era are difficult to fathom. What makes this even more shocking is that these horrific punishments occurred despite the existence of laws ostensibly meant to protect slaves. Well, it was a mockery of the system and laws. Number 8. Mutilation. Slaves endured grueling physical labor, especially on cotton plantations and in the fields. However, those working in their masters' homes were often expected to meet specific appearance standards, which often favored slaves with lighter skin or superior communication skills. Unfortunately, when acts of resistance arose among slaves or conflicts erupted, slave owners frequently resorted to mutilation or cutting off legs, arms, and sometimes nose and ear as a form of punishment. These barbaric acts ranged from cutting off ears or flesh to more extreme measures such as amputating limbs, gouging out eyes, severing hamstrings, and even castrating both males and females. Tragically, the victims of these brutal acts rarely received any medical attention or treatment for their injuries, leading many to succumb to infections, severe blood loss, and other life-threatening complications. Number 7. Whipping. During the days of American slavery, whipping stood as a gruesome form of punishment, being a nightmarish symbol of oppression. But whenever we think about whipping, we don't really feel what it means. People talk insensitively about black slaves whipping that one feels it was normal for them to be whipped. This has to be changed. Whipping echoed with the agonizing crack of the whip slicing through flesh. It was a merciless tool wielded by slave owners and overseers to instill fear, suppress any fraction of rebellion, and perpetuate white supremacy. The lash not only inflicted physical torment but etched deep emotional scars, forever branding its victims as subjugated souls. In the words of Harriet Jacobs, an escaped slave and courageous author, the brutality of whipping was hauntingly vivid. She recounted a grim incident where a plantation slave was mercilessly lashed by his owner. He was beaten so badly that once the master stopped, the walls of the room were found stained with blood. Gordon, known as Whipped Peter, whose back bore marks of worst whipping, was one of the millions of black slaves who were whipped daily. These marks were a permanent reminder of the unspeakable anguish endured by enslaved people. Yet, the cruelty did not cease with the initial lashings. Some sadistic owners went to horrific lengths to intensify their slaves' suffering. As wounds began to heal, they would order to bring the black slaves and whip them again so the wounds could open. Even red pepper and turpentine were applied to the raw wounds, unleashing unimaginable pain. One horrifying account even speaks of an owner grinding a brick into dust, mixing it with lard, and rubbing this vile concoction into the deep wounds of a defenseless slave. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community and we need your support. Let's continue now. Number 6. Branding. Branding, a horrific practice involving burning flesh with a heated metal tool to leave a permanent mark, was used to indicate ownership of slaves. This marking made it easier to identify slaves and deter theft or unauthorized sales. While branding of livestock has been discontinued due to pain, what black slaves were forced to endure was considered normal. Large companies often branded their slaves to assert ownership and discourage others from making claims. In Louisiana, the Code Moore law even permitted branding as a punishment for attempted escape. By 1840, New Orleans had become the largest slave market in the country, subjecting hundreds of thousands to this cruel practice. Particularly in the southern states, branding became a common form of punishment for slaves who dared to seek freedom. The branding mark, often a letter or distinctive symbol, was seared onto the slave's face. Black slaves with this mark were a reminder to the owners that these slaves resisted and should not be allowed to work in their houses or serve in more privileged roles. The act of branding left a permanent scar, both physical and emotional, serving as a painful reminder of their status as property and the dire consequences of seeking freedom. Number 5. Hogshed. Moses Roper, a former slave who bravely escaped slavery, documented the horrors he witnessed. He recounted the chilling narrative of a slaveholder who possessed a grotesque instrument of torment, a large barrel known as a hogshed. This barrel was a chamber of nightmares filled with nails whose sharp ends pointed inward. With callous disregard for humanity, the owner compelled black slaves into these barrels and then sent them hurtling down steep hillsides. Black slaves were wedged into these barrels, nails piercing their flesh, as they endured a perilous descent. All the while, the owner and fellow slaves looked on, spectators to a grotesque spectacle of suffering. Number 4. Suspended over fire. Harriet Jacobs, a courageous woman who managed to escape the horrors of slavery and later penned her experiences, shared a chilling tale of torment. She found herself in the clutches of a relentless slave owner who subjected her to ceaseless harassment, despite his wife's objections. To avoid getting exploited by her owner, Harriet took refuge in a hidden crawl space within her grandmother's ceiling, where she endured 7 agonizing years before ultimately finding her way to freedom in England. Yet this was not the only horrifying ordeal she would face. Close to her hiding spot was a heartless slaveholder who kept hundreds of black slaves. This master had a gruesome and horrifying punishment that he favored. He would suspend a helpless slave above the ground and then ignite a fire beneath them. As the flames crackled and spat, a piece of fatty pork would be suspended over the black slave. The burning fat would drip onto the unfortunate slave's bare skin, inflicting excruciating pain. Each searing drop of scalding fat that fell from above left searing marks on their bodies. The intense heat only intensified their suffering, turning it into a nightmarish ordeal. Number 3. Demotion or sale. The horrors of slavery extended beyond physical brutality, as George Washington, the nation's founding president, endorsed psychological torment as well. While the term demotion may not immediately convey the same level of horror as some of the other punishments we have explored, for a slave, it spelled the difference between life and death. Slaves who failed to meet their owners' expectations or didn't work hard enough faced the grim prospect of demotion. This entailed being stripped of their current, perhaps less physically demanding roles, such as domestic work or skilled trades, and being thrust into the harsh fields. Number 2. Forced reproduction. Among the horrors suffered by slaves, forced reproduction ranks among the most harrowing. Black slaves frequently endured vile harassment and assaults, with no legal safeguards to shield them from such brutality. When women became pregnant as a result of these heinous acts, they rarely received medical care or any special consideration. In fact, they often faced even harsher treatment from the wives of their owners. Even black male slaves were not exempted from suffering. They were coerced into sexual relations with various women as their owners exploited them for their own gain. This added layer of anguish compounded the misery they were already enduring. You see, in 1808, the United States enacted a law prohibiting the importation of slaves, leading to a shortage of black slaves. As a result, the demand for black slaves, especially those capable of reproduction, surged. Slaves were bought and sold based on their reproductive capabilities and compelled to mate with others to produce more children for their owners. Number 1. Chained to trees until death. When black slaves would do something which their masters hated, they were given the most horrifying punishment: chained to trees in the far-off forest until they died. Black slaves were forced and brought to the forest they had never seen before. Then they were tied tightly to trees, ensuring that they could not move even a few inches. No food or water was left nearby because the entire point of chaining to trees was to torture the black slaves to death. The slave masters would enjoy thinking about how black slaves would be struggling, how their bodies would be getting weaker every day, and how a slow death would come. This horrible punishment would end when the black slave would die while staying chained. Sometimes, if masters were kind, they would send some slaves to recover the body. Otherwise, animals would eat the dead bodies or they would rot. Did you know black slaves were treated this way? Is it fair to wipe these things from history books? Will this save them from embarrassment and shame? Speak out and let us know your opinion on this in the comments section right below. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.